right, the last couple of traits we're going to talk about are, again, just modifications of the normal cross. So one of the things that you should be aware of is that a lot of times a gene can affect more than just one phenotypic trait. There's no cross for this, but for example, a Manx cat is a cat with no tail, and it turns out that the gene that causes them to have no tail also controls backbone development. So having a particular gene combination doesn't just make them tailless, but in a lot of cases gives them back problems. And another example of this is achondroplastic dwarfism, or it's a form of dwarfism. And you may recognize this picture on the left. This is from Little People, Big World. In this case, this is caused by a dominant gene. So these two parents are actually both heterozygous, big D, little d, big D, little d. And it turns out that this particular gene controls more than just making them shorter than normal. This dominant gene for dwarfism actually controls some developmental things. And if these two have a child, it turns out that there's a 1 in 4 chance if the child inherits both copies of the dwarfism gene, the mom will miscarry, because you have to get at least one normal copy in order to survive. These heterozygous ones would have dwarfism, and this son does. And then little d, this would be normal height, just like most of you, hopefully all of you actually, are normal height. And notice 3 of their 4 children are actually normal height. So remember, I've told you this before, dominant, a trait being dominant doesn't necessarily mean it's common. Dwarfism is dominant. That means these kids that have normal height do not have any bigger chance of having a child with dwarfism than you or me, because they're homozygous recessive. They do not carry the gene for dwarfism. The only way a normal person, by the way, could have a child with dwarfism, because you might say, well, I don't understand, if it's dominant, how could normal parents have a child with it? And it turns out it's because it can occur as a spontaneous mutation. I believe it's on chromosome 4. And if that mutation happens, then your child would be born with dwarfism. But otherwise, if you're normal height, you're not carrying that gene, so you can't pass it on. All right, and then the last type of cross that we're going to talk about is what's called multiple alleles. So multiple alleles, the traits we've done so far have only had 2 alleles. For example, tall or short, 2 alleles. That's it. Or red versus white. There was just 2 alleles. But some traits have more than 2, and blood type's a good example of that. So blood type is controlled, it's these proteins on the surface of your blood cells called immunoglobulins. And there are actually 3 alleles. There's IA, which codes for blood type A, IB, which codes for B, and then little I, and you could be O if your genotype is little I, little I. So A and B are codominant. We talked about this in another lecture. So if you're IA, or IA little I, your blood type would be A, IB, or IB little I, you're B, IB, you'd be AB, and then little I, your blood type would be O. So this is called multiple alleles because there's more than 2 options, even though you can only be carrying 2 copies of the gene, but there's more than 2 things to choose from. And here are 2 practice problems with this. So a male who's heterozygous for type A, so he's IA little I, marries a female who's O, so she's little I, little I. They want to know what kinds of children they can have, so the cross would look like this. So they would basically have a 50% chance, a 1/2 chance of type A children, and a 1/2 chance of type O children. So that's how you would do a cross like that. Now, the second one, a male who's type A marries a female who's type B. So we know he's IA something, and she's IB something. And then notice they tell you that they have a type O child, and this is significant. They're not just telling you this for no reason. They're telling you this because if they had a child who's recessive, type O, that's how we know what their second letter is. In other words, we know he's type A, but how do you know if he's IA or IA little I? Well, if they had a child that was O, that tells us each of them had to be carrying little I, because that child had to have gotten a copy of little I from both parents. So this is our cross, and it would look like this: IA little I, IB little I. And interestingly, in this particular cross, they could actually have, I'm just going to write the phenotypes in here, not their genotypes. So they could have an AB child, they could have a B child, an A child, or an O child. They could actually have all 4 possible blood types in their children. So that's a very interesting cross. So that's called multiple alleles. And to wrap things up, just a comment that sometimes we think a gene is bad, and there may be some benefit to it. And a good example of this is sickle cell anemia. So there's a gene that codes for sickle cell anemia. The blood cells have a sickle shape, and it causes a lot of problems. But it turns out that having one copy of the gene, being like big B, little b, and the little b, it's recessive, sickle cell, that little b, it makes them resistant to malaria. And malaria happens to be a disease that's very common in Africa. It's carried by mosquitoes. So what we find is a gene for a disease that causes a lot of problems. It's a bad disease. But why does it stay so common? Like 60% of people in Africa actually carry this gene. And what we find is because it helps them to survive malaria, if we look at a map, the areas where people carry sickle cell genes kind of map out with the areas where malaria is the most common. So it offered a survival advantage, which is very interesting. And finally, keep in mind that environment also affects phenotype and gene expression. I mentioned this another day. So if you look at the Arctic fox, for example, the gene is actually triggered only by high temperatures. So if you saw this white fox, he could be big B, big B, big B, little b, or little b, little b. You actually wouldn't know until the summer came. Then in the summer, if he was little b, he'd be albino, he would still be white. So you wouldn't necessarily know because it's actually triggered by temperature. And for these flowers, the gene for color is the same, but the color of flower that you see is actually influenced by the pH of the soil. So the gene itself doesn't change. It makes the same pigment, but the pigment actually reacts with, I think it's aluminum in the soil, and it makes the flowers different colors. So what you see as a phenotype is not 100% determined just by your genes. And we're going to talk about this later, but there's something called epigenetics, and basically just changing the diet of a mother during pregnancy can actually affect what genes are expressed when the offspring come out. So you can have a particular gene combination, but it's not just what genes you have, it's what factors activate the genes. Are the genes in an on position or an off position? So it gets actually really complicated and very, very interesting. We're going to talk about that in later chapters.